Hello everyone, welcome to our first lecture on our next unit, the Cold War. By the time World War II ended in 1945, it was becoming very apparent what the next conflict would be based off of. As Russia was invading from the east and the United States and the rest of the Allies were invading from the west and squeezing Germany to the last days of World War II, it was already becoming quite apparent that the next struggle, the next possible world war, would be between two major ideologies: the democratic, capitalistic nations of the West and the communist nations of Eastern Europe, with the headquarters of Moscow, Russia. So we are going to see this conflict and how we got to the point where really the next war could have resulted in nuclear holocaust. Albert Einstein said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but Albert Einstein said, "I don't know how World War III will be fought, but World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones." He knew that if war were to break out with these new weapons of mass destruction, that it would be total catastrophe, and he was absolutely right. So let's go ahead and dig into the notes, take a look at this, frankly, somewhat terrifying unit where we truly were on the brink of nuclear holocaust multiple times. The weapons, never before in human history have weapons been this powerful, to where they could truly destroy entire cities with a single bomb. That is what we are talking about here. You can see one of the tests right here in the Bikini Atoll, where they were testing some nuclear weapons, and they just became bigger and bigger and bigger, more destructive as the decades go on. And both sides had them. So let's go ahead and get into it. We do need to back up to the end of World War II. What we see at the end of World War II is that Europe lay in ruin. Pretty much all the nations of Europe are destroyed. The old world really has come to an end. The nations of Britain and France and Germany are just completely laid to waste. Their cities are leveled by bombings over the last 5 years, and what we see is their economies are completely drained. There are only two nations that emerge economically stronger after World War II, and the first of those so-called superpowers is the United States. Okay. Now, we had a very strict set of goals that we wanted to implement. We had talked a little bit about that in our World War II unit, but the United States does want to see a world that is focused on democracy, having a voice for as many people as possible. We also try to avoid the mistakes from World War I, in which we did not extend any help to those nations, and it led countries like Germany into very negative, radical economic situations in which they turned to very radical political leaders like Adolf Hitler. So we are trying to avoid that mistake again. So our first goal is to help rebuild Europe. We're going to see this with the Marshall Plan, billions of dollars sent over to our allies, including some nations that we had just gotten done destroying, Japan and Germany. Again, World War II, a lot of it was economically based, so we are trying to kind of extend our dominance in Europe to make sure that we have some friends in Europe and that they can get back on their feet and avoid any radical situations that could evolve there. Now, Harry S. Truman, we mentioned him at the end of the World War II unit. He did become president after FDR passed away in 1945. He was the one that decided to drop the atomic bombs on Japan, ending World War II. In 1948, he shocks the world by being reelected. His popularity had actually declined by that point, and you can see the famous photograph in the bottom right-hand corner where he holds up the mistaken headline that was published the night before because everyone was so certain that he was going to lose this election. But Truman is reelected in 1948. He runs on a campaign that he calls the Fair Deal. We talked, we've seen the Square Deal with Teddy Roosevelt. We've seen the New Deal with FDR, and here we have the Fair Deal, in which he promises certain things that are focused on making especially the lower half of society economically stronger. So we see a rising minimum wage, a whopping 75 cents an hour, increased Social Security by 75%. So again, those that are reaching retirement age, give them kind of a little bit of an emergency net that they can fall back on if they need it. and also increasing things like low-income housing, which, of course, when people have stable shelter, they were able to focus on building up the economy elsewhere. Now, Congress is going to be his biggest problem, and Congress is heavily Republican. He is a Democrat, and so they're not wanting to push through a lot of his legislation. The Congress at the time, as we're going to see, is frankly very opposed to civil rights measures. Civil rights is our next unit. What we're going to see is the impact that World War II had, especially on the over 1 million African Americans that fought in that war. They're coming back and frankly demanding equal rights that they had experienced, entering the cafes of Paris, being seated at a table regardless of their race. So we're going to see civil rights come to a head here under Truman's administration. We also see issues of national health insurance emerge. That issue has not gone away. How much role should the government have in sponsoring health insurance? I mean, that was one of the biggest deals, of course, even with Obama's administration. So that issue begins here, but it has not gone away. We have not reached kind of a conclusion on that. Now, the America that Truman is leading becomes known in the history books as the affluent society. The standard of living is drastically going to increase during this period. The Great Depression is officially over after World War II, and in the 1950s in particular, we're going to see a major rise, a boom in this country where it leads people to buying houses and buying more goods. You have some classic advertisements here, frankly, often very sexist advertisements, but we are seeing a major boom in the economies of the United States during that time. Now, one reason so many people were able to get a leg up is because we are welcoming back millions of veterans from the war, and the government had passed a bill called the GI Bill. And what this did was, which still is in place today, my family has personally benefited from it. I know my grandfather applied for the GI Bill after returning from the Navy. And it was able to buy their first house using the GI Bill. My father used the GI Bill to partially pay for his college education. So basically the GI Bill was a government program that extended some help to veterans, both in terms of perhaps lower loans for buying a house or even paying for their college. So what we see is a rise in housing in particular. We're going to see the rise of the suburbs in the 1950s, and it is mainly due to the GI Bill of veterans coming back and establishing themselves in these communities, and we see really more of what modern America has turned into. There's also another side effect of all these veterans returning from war, and I won't get into the details of this, but let's just say that there was a tremendous baby boom upon the return of these veterans. There's a huge rise in population, and part of that is due to the rising economy as well. People can afford to have more children. So we have the largest generation in American history is born in the late 40s and early 50s. So a lot of prosperity leads to more people. And so we still see that. Of course, that generation is now getting to retirement age, and we're seeing the effects that massive generation has on things like Social Security. So still very much a part of our world today. Now, even though the affluent society was kind of the category of the United States at the time, that did not mean that everyone was very well off. In fact, poverty for the lowest portion of society still remained very much in effect. About a fifth of Americans are living below the poverty line. A tremendous, a better situation than what we saw in the Great Depression, but still, you're looking at about 20% of people that are still living below that poverty line. But like I said, there's a real big shift happening here, and that is people are leaving the cities and heading out to these suburbs where more houses are being mass produced. And that'll have major effects on just the layout of the country. So on the flip side, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, we saw them emerge in World War II. And by the way, in this lecture, I'll probably refer to them in various ways. I might say the Soviets or the Russians. the USSR, it's all the same thing, okay? So the USSR does emerge as the other superpower, and you will need to know that for the test, who the two superpowers were. But the USSR has much different goals in place. Remember, they are a communist society in which a totalitarian leader in Joseph Stalin, the government is deciding pretty much every aspect of your life, what job you will have, where you will be educated, where you will live. Private property is abolished. So, this is literally as exact opposite as you could get on the spectrum of economic systems. They have a much different goal. Whereas we're trying to rebuild Europe, the USSR, frankly, wants to punish Germany. Keep in mind their history. Over the last 20 years, the USSR has been attacked by Germany twice, and they have literally lost upwards. I don't even know the full amount. I know, we talked about in Operation Barbarossa, they lost 5 million people alone in that battle. But they have, in the last multiple wars, they have lost tens of millions of people. That truly changes their mindset. We did not, of course, have that level of sacrifice. So they are not only wanting to punish Germany, but they want to make sure that Germany is never able to rise up and attack them again. So as they have swept in at the end of World War II through Eastern Europe, at the end of the war, we left. But they are going to stay, and frankly, they set up communist governments in all those Eastern European countries. Their goal is to form a buffer zone, kind of this neutral area of countries loyal to them, that if Germany ever were to rise up again, frankly, they would have to encounter all of their allies before they could invade Russia. So we're going to see the spread of communism, which was pretty much automatic. As the Red Army swept through Eastern Europe, like I said, they just stayed there. So those poor countries in Eastern Europe traded one occupier in the Nazis for another occupier in the Soviets. But, just understand that this is kind of the battleground. This is the first battleground of the Cold War, is who is going to control Europe. And it looked as if this would be the flashpoint that started World War III. There was a lot of pressure, especially in places like Berlin, and we're going to talk about that later on. Now, there were a lot of decisions that had to be made after World War II, and so the big three, the United States, United Kingdom, and the Soviet Union, began to get together towards the end of the war, trying to make these decisions, things that they could all agree upon, the Allied leaders. Churchill for the UK, Truman for the US, and of course Stalin, as I said, for the Soviet Union. Potsdam is going to be one area that they meet to make some big decisions on a few different areas. The first is, what do you do with Germany? Okay, Germany has just been defeated in this war, and again, you have to stamp out Nazism. So how do you go about that? Well, what they decided to do at Potsdam was divide up Germany into 4 occupation zones. They would be controlled by the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviets. Now, those 4 zones incorporated a number of large cities. So each side, of this occupation zones, of course, set up those occupation zones in their kind of own image. So what we're going to see is that the UK, France, and the United States set up capitalist economies in those countries, and the Soviet Union sets up a communist government in those in Eastern Germany. Now, even the city of Berlin, which of course was the capital, very important, they decide to divide Berlin up into 4 zones as well. We are just a few years away from the Berlin Wall. This is the beginning of that. But Berlin will be divided up and occupied by the Allies. And like I said, the biggest problem there is that Berlin lies in the Eastern Sphere. It lies under the Soviet sphere of influence. And so what you have is basically Western Berlin is going to be capitalist, and they are completely surrounded by communists. So that's going to lead to some problems we'll talk about in a couple future slides here. The second thing they decided at Potsdam is what to do with the Nazi leaders that had led this war, that had started this war, and frankly had conducted the Holocaust. So they set up what were called the Nuremberg trials. They returned to the city in which a lot of the Holocaust, you could argue, began with the Nuremberg laws, and they prosecuted a number of high-ranking Nazi officials, some of which were even sentenced to death for their roles in the war and their roles in the Holocaust. Now, one word you're going to hear me refer to a lot during this lecture and during this unit is the word containment. Okay, now Truman has a big problem, right? Because the Soviets have already swept through and occupied Eastern Europe, and they are putting pressure on other countries, some of which are neutral or frankly battling, to decide if they're going to be communist or capitalist or democratic. And so Truman has to decide, what do we do? Are we going to try to end communism? Because that's definitely going to lead to another conflict. Or do we try to contain communism? Now, like I said, by the end of the war, it was very apparent that this was going to be the next battle. 1 year after the war, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, came to America to engage in some lectures across the country. And actually, while he was speaking in Missouri, of all places, Fulton, Missouri, he gave a speech that becomes one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. And he says that an iron curtain has descended upon Europe. And although he was speaking figuratively, the Iron Curtain was in some ways very real. There was not an actual wall dividing these nations, but what he was saying was that the symbolic wall on the eastern side of that exists communism, and on the western side exists democracy. So, what are we going to do? Are we going to try to contain it where it already exists, or are we going to try to defeat communism once and for all? Well, by 1947, Truman had to make some decisions. In particular, there were two nations that were fighting civil wars that were basically, you had the communists on one side, and you had those pushing for democracy and capitalism on the other. In Greece and Turkey, both of those nations were heavily war-torn, and what Truman decided to do, which becomes known as the Truman Doctrine, this is the first time that we institute this containment policy, and that is to try and contain communism where it already exists. And although we're unwilling to put troops in those situations, our own troops, we do offer military aid to both Greece and Turkey. I want to remind you, back at the beginning of World War II, we talked about the Spanish Civil War and how the Allied nations were so afraid of getting wrapped up in a war that they didn't even offer support to those that side of the Civil War in Spain that they would have supported, and they lost. So Truman's trying to make sure that that does not occur here. So it's a little risky, but ultimately this policy of containment is going to be what America pursues, frankly, for the next really 30, 40 years. We'll see the policies change depending on who's president, but containment will become our main policy. Now, I have in the notes there the domino effect. This was basically the idea that if you allowed one country to fall to communism, that basically surrounding countries would fall, and then you have this domino effect where now all of a sudden you have half the world taken over by communists. So the idea was to try and stop that domino effect from occurring. So, help out those that are supporting democracy and fighting against communism. Now, like I said, the main goal of the United States after the war is to help rebuild Europe. And, this was not all a selfless reason. It wasn't just in the goodness of our hearts. We are noting that Europe is becoming a battleground, and we got to secure some allies in this fight. So we institute what's called the Marshall Plan. We literally spend billions of dollars to help rebuild these countries that some of which, like I said, we had just gotten done bombing a few months before. But by basically paying to rebuild these countries, we also secure an ally in those nations. In particular, nations like France. There was a strong communist movement in France, but the Marshall Plan helped combat that by saying, listen, if we side with the United States in this, we're going to be getting billions of dollars of aid. So this is the beginning of what frankly amounts to U.S. policy even to this day of basically supporting our allies through monetary means. But the Marshall Plan is a tremendous success. It's one of the best programs the United States has ever put together, and it does help get Europe back on their feet. And what we're going to see is within a decade, those nations that have benefited from the Marshall Plan are going to almost have fully recovered, whereas Eastern Europe just dives deeper and deeper into poverty. Now, like I said, Berlin is going to be the major flashpoint of this early Cold War period. Berlin itself, like I mentioned, was divided up into 4 zones. After a few years, the United States, United Kingdom, and France, all of which who had instituted democratic capitalist systems in Berlin, in West Berlin, decided to merge their zones. Now, the Soviet Union took this as both an insult, but also a sign that the Western nations were working together against Soviet interests. Again, their goal is to stop Germany from rising up again, and by unifying these zones under a democratic banner, the Soviets saw that as a major slight to them. And so, in response, they are going to form a blockade around Berlin. They're not going to allow any supplies in or out, which that's a major problem for those citizens in West Berlin who the United States, Britain, and France are supposed to be aiding. So all of a sudden, the roads get cut off to Western Berlin. No food is getting into Western Berlin. It looks like it's a very bad situation that is going to develop. Well, if you can't go by land, can't go by sea, you go by air. The United States is going to begin what's called the Berlin Airlift, and we will fly quite literally millions of tons of supplies, most of which is food, into Western Berlin. Now, this was a risky maneuver because, we are obviously avoiding the blockade, and if the Soviet Union had decided to fire on these planes, it very well would have resulted in World War III. The blockade would last for 327 days before it was fully lifted. In that time, the United States would send over 250,000 planes into West Berlin, delivering upwards of 2.3 million tons of supplies to the West Berliners. And ultimately, that pressure worked. The Soviets were unwilling to, put themselves in a situation of war. They did not fire on any of the planes, thankfully. And frankly, they just kind of look like the bad guys here in terms of, public viewership of this situation. They are the bad guys, and the United States is just simply trying to deliver food to Western Berlin. And so the United States, the prestige of the United States is boosted because of the Berlin Airlift, and the Soviets are kind of taken down a few levels. But it's not too long before 2 separate alliances are formed. On the western side, you have NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which included all the nations of Western Europe, along with the United States. And this was a defensive alliance. In their mission statement, it is stated that an attack on one member of NATO is an attack on all members of NATO. Therefore, if Western Germany is ever invaded by the Soviets, it's like an attack on the United States. So, this is important for a number of reasons. Number one, this is the first military alliance the United States has ever signed in a supposed peacetime. There was no active conflict, but there was definitely an ideological struggle, and we are sitting here forming military alliances during a peacetime. That's the first time that's ever actually occurred. So again, this idea that America is kind of bouncing around between interventionism and isolationism, we have completely abandoned isolationism by this point, which again, our role now as kind of the lone Western superpower, we do see ourselves as kind of the leader of this pact and trying to protect those nations. But again, you have to look at things from the Soviet perspective as well. The Western nations are all of a sudden allying together. If you're the East, you could see that as a threat. Okay, so of course they respond in turn with what's called the Warsaw Pact, and this is another mutual defense treaty that is formed between Eastern European nations that are loyal to Moscow, the capital of Russia. So for the remainder, frankly, up until the 1990s, what we're going to see is NATO versus the Warsaw Pact. This tense standoff. And frankly, this has not fully disappeared, even though the Warsaw Pact, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, spoiler alert, would happen later on in the 80s and early 90s. The Warsaw Pact kind of goes away. Even to this day, NATO exists, and frankly, Russia continues to see NATO as a tremendous threat to them. So, every once in a while we'll see Russia kind of mobilize troops along the border with some NATO countries, and it is still a very tense situation today. Now, it wasn't just resigned to Europe. This was also happening in Asia, where they began to organize some alliances. Asia is going to be the second flashpoint of the Cold War, especially after the rise of Chinese communism, and we're going to see Vietnam War, the Korean War, all of these centered on democracy versus capitalism. So just understand that the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, otherwise known as SEATO, was an alliance between Western nations and Southeastern countries. Now, in September 3rd, 1949, the Cold War is truly going to heat up because up until this point, there has been one country that have had nuclear weapons, and that is the United States. But in 1949, we detect over the skies of Moscow, over Russia, I should say, we have detected that the Soviets had successfully detonated a nuclear bomb. They were able to take radioactive surveys in the skies, and we did notice that they had tested a nuclear bomb. What this means is that the Cold War has completely changed by 1949. The Soviets have the bomb. We are not the only ones with the bomb, and what that means is if there is any conflict, it could very well result in nuclear war. And again, if a nuclear war breaks out, we are not talking about a small contained war. We're talking about, frankly, nuclear holocaust, perhaps. Every major city bombed with a nuclear weapon, and instead of perhaps a few thousand dying, we're talking all of a sudden about millions dying instantaneously. So you have this struggle between the United States and the Soviet Union on who has the most missiles. Okay, now we'll talk about how ridiculous that kind of is later on because really you can't use them. But what the term that the United States starts focusing on is what's called the missile gap. We believe that to remain superior in this fight, we had to have more nuclear weapons than the Soviet Union. Now, the result of this is we start building up more than they do, okay, and they're trying to keep up. They're scared that we're going to have such a higher superiority in numbers of nuclear weapons, so they continue to build, and then that just forces us to build more. So what you have is what's called an arms race. Same thing happened at the beginning of World War I, where you had both Germany and Britain kind of threatened by each other and just building as many military weapons as they could. Same thing's happening here, but just with a much thinner margin of error. So the arms race is when both of those nations, both superpowers, begin to kind of race to build as many nuclear weapons as possible. Now, over in Asia, like I said, the second flashpoint of the Cold War, the Chinese had been fighting a civil war amongst themselves before World War II began. In 1931, Japan had invaded China, and after a few years, China had kind of put a timeout on the Civil War, but after World War II ends, they actually resumed this Civil War, and this time the nationalist government is in much worse situation, and the Chinese communists are able to win this Civil War. So, I think 1946 is the year that they end up winning that Civil War. All of a sudden now you have the largest country in terms of population that has just gone to a communist system. Mao Zedong is the leader of the Chinese communists. He will become the dictator of China until his death in 1976, I believe. But the U.S. will send over $3 billion in aid trying to fight against Mao Zedong. But again, it does not work. I guess I've gotten a little bit ahead of myself. There was, kind of the brutality of this civil war. Chiang Kai-shek, the president of China, who we were kind of allied with, he's trying to root out the communists in the Civil War, and frankly was very brutal. He was not necessarily a good guy in how they were killing civilians in the streets, and so frankly that drove a lot of people to the communist side. Ultimately, the Chinese nationalists will have to flee China, and they go to the small island neighboring China called Taiwan. Now today, the Taiwanese government claims to still be kind of the main government of China, basically the Chinese government in exile. And it still is a pretty big flashpoint even today, because the Chinese believe that they are the ones controlling Taiwan. Taiwan kind of believes that they have this government in exile over China, and even still today, this is a major pressure. In fact, I'll never forget a few years back, we had some Chinese exchange students come over for a week, and one of them was flipping through an American history textbook, and they came across the atlas showing that region of the world. And one girl became quite, upset because, all the different countries, of course, are different colors, but she noticed that Taiwan was a different color than China, and she didn't understand why Taiwan would have been considered separate because every year of her schooling, she had been taught that Taiwan was a part of China. It really was a major moment in my mind of realizing that their education, that it had been presented completely different, and even today the Chinese continue to press to basically take over Taiwan, and frankly our alliance with Taiwan is kind of the only thing keeping them back. But as I said, if the end result of the Chinese Civil War is that communism has won in China, and they remain a communist society today. But it really causes people to question Truman's policy, the Truman Doctrine. Is containment working? Because frankly, you've just lost 1 billion people to communism, and this is really where that domino effect comes into play. If China falls, well, what about India? Okay, what about Pakistan? What about all these nations? Next thing you know, all of Asia could be communist. So Truman's support really begins to wane. In fact, by the time he leaves office, he will leave office with the lowest approval rating of any president in history. The next area that is a major flashpoint is Korea. And of course, we are going to fight a war here in Korea, and this will be the last section of today's notes. But Korea had been taken over by the Japanese Empire back in 1910. After World War II came to an end, Korea was liberated, but the decision had to be made, just like Germany. What do we do with Korea? How do we set it up? Because part of Korea borders Russia, and they wanted to influence Korea by making it a communist nation, whereas the United States had an active role in Korea as well. So they decided to split Korea in two. Up until this point, Korea had always been a single united country, but in the following World War II, Korea is divided, and it remains divided to this day along the 38th parallel. Now, what is the result is that the northern part of Korea, North Korea, is going to develop as a communist system with the help of Russia. The southern part of Korea is going to develop as a democratic capitalist system. The democracy piece takes a while, but we won't get into that detail. But they remain that way today. In fact, North Korea remains really the only totalitarian society in the world today. South Korea has thrived with capitalism, and in fact, it's amazing to see the benefits that have happened. And I'll show you a slide later on that'll show you some visible evidence of their economic success. Now, let's talk about how the Korean War actually developed. So, in 1949, both the Soviet Union and the United States have been in Korea for 4 years. They both set up rival governments in these two different regions. And the Korean people, of course, want to reunite. It had always been, just like if somebody had invaded our country, divided us in two, we would probably want to unite again after that occupier left. So in 1950, North Korea is going to try and reunite the South by invading. They will invade June 25th, 1950. Truman obviously recognizes this crisis. We begin to send support in terms of military supplies to South Korea, but it's very difficult because the North Koreans have aid from the Soviets. They have tanks and planes, and frankly, they move into South Korea very quickly, and it looks like this thing's going to be over before it really even began. Now, one very different aspect of this war is that the United States, instead of just sending in our own troops, will actually go to the newly formed United Nations. We talked about the United Nations at the end of our World War II unit. This organization was meant to try and keep world peace. There are other things that they try to do, raise education levels throughout the world and whatnot. But this organization, at the heart of it, is to try and maintain world peace. Every nation in the world sends representatives, and they can vote on conflicts, whether they should join those conflicts or not. So Truman goes to the United Nations and he says, listen, this war is happening, and instead of us getting directly involved, we would like the United Nations to support that. The U.S. gets that support. And usually, without getting into the full detail of how the UN is set up, there's kind of the last, even if the United Nations votes to in this situation, join this conflict, it still has to be okayed by what's called the Security Council. There's a group of, I think at the time, 5 countries, kind of the top nations in the world: the U.S., Soviet Union, Britain, some of these other nations, and basically any of those Security Council members can veto any action that the United Nations decides to take. Well, it just so happened that the Soviet Union was boycotting the United Nations the week that Truman brought this before them. So, because the Soviet Union was not there to boycott or to veto this action, the United Nations does vote to basically insert their role into South Korea and try and protect them from invasion. So the United Nations is going to send over 500,000 troops made up of various countries, the very bulk of which come from the American side. 90% of those troops are Americans. But 16 different countries will donate troops to try and end this conflict. There is a World War II general that is selected to lead the United Nations troops, and his name is General Douglas MacArthur. We've seen him multiple units now, but he is in charge of the United Nations and the U.S. He was the occupier of Japan for years after the war, and he is selected to basically push the North Koreans back over the border. And he does so. In fact, the military maneuvers that he pushes, work dramatically well. He pushes the North Koreans back over the 38th parallel to kind of where the original borders were. But then MacArthur's faced with a very tough decision. Now, if you're MacArthur, do you stop there? Do you stop at the 38th parallel and say, hey, North Korea's up there, South Korea's down here, we're all good now? Or do you take this opportunity, since you got the North Koreans on the run, and do you go into North Korea and try to perhaps unify Korea under a democratic banner, under a capitalist banner? MacArthur makes that fateful decision to pursue the North Koreans across the 38th parallel. They do invade North Korea, but the whole time this is happening, China is watching. Now, China is newly communist, North Korea is communist, and they have warned the world that if MacArthur gets close to China, that they will become involved in this conflict. MacArthur doesn't frankly care. MacArthur is a very interesting personality, very egotistical, and he decides to invade North Korea anyways. And in fact, they at one point even invade China itself. Well, that is a major, major mistake. Excuse me. Once the Chinese get involved, 300,000 Chinese push the United Nations back to the 38th parallel, and you have what amounts to a stalemate. 2 more years of fighting. At some points, the United Nations are pushing the Chinese and North Koreans back. At other times, they're pushing us back. There are no large victories, and it just continues this dance of death along the 38th parallel. Now, at this time, MacArthur's starting to become a little bit more desperate. In fact, he even calls on the use of nuclear weapons against China. Now, keep in mind, the only nuclear weapons that have ever been dropped in war was World War II. So he goes to Truman and he says, Truman, we need to use these nukes. We got them. We might as well use them in this conflict. If we don't, they will. Okay? Truman, I think, makes one of the most fateful decisions in world history here, and that is he tells MacArthur, no, we are not going to use nuclear weapons. He sets that precedent that just because we are in a conflict does not mean that we will absolutely use nuclear weapons. And so, MacArthur is basically denied that usage, but MacArthur doesn't quite give up. In fact, he will even, in interviews, he will talk about, the fact that Truman's kind of weak on this point, that we need to use these nukes. We have them. We should be using them to save American lives. Listen, here's the deal. At the end of the day, President Truman is the commander-in-chief. What that means is he is above any and all generals. He is the one in charge of the full military might of the United States. If he says no, the answer is no. MacArthur didn't get that. And so ultimately, MacArthur ends up getting fired by President Truman. So you already have, this president who's not very well liked, all of a sudden firing one of the most well-liked generals in American history. I mean, he's a war hero, and in fact, MacArthur would return from the conflict with ticker tape parades in New York, and Truman's kind of public view. People do not like him even more after this. But I think looking back, I think most historians agree that Truman was right. If you set that precedent of nuclear war anytime there is a conflict, man, the world would be a very different place today. By 1953, there is a ceasefire declared. Now notice I did not say an armistice, or I didn't say an end to the war, a ceasefire. And believe it or not, that ceasefire still exists to this day. It is the longest running conflict in world history, as far as I know, in which North Korea and South Korea are still technically at war, but there's been this long-lasting ceasefire. Now, the two countries agreed to put in place what they called a demilitarized zone, or the DMZ, along that 38th parallel. No side is able to cross the other, or else it would be seen as a denial of the ceasefire. All told, the Korean War, which, by the way, I should mention, was being fought by many of which were veterans of World War II. Men that had gone over and risked their lives. Many of them are fighting in the same conflict. My grandfather was one of those men who had fought all of World War II in the Navy, and then he actually continued with a career in the Navy. But he is fighting in the Korean War as well. I can't imagine that level of sacrifice that this generation had, to really fight two of the most devastating wars in American history within 10 years of one another. But at the end of the Korean War, or at least the ceasefire, 54,000 Americans had died. There had been a cost of $20 billion. And frankly, Americans kind of turn a new corner here because they are not willing to, every few years, dedicate 50+ thousand American lives to a conflict, especially a place that many Americans couldn't even point out on a map. So what we're going to see is that America does start to think much more conservatively when it comes to combating communism. And while we do push in a policy of containment, what we're going to see is that they're not as willing to use boots on the ground in order to try and contain communism. Now, we're not done with these wars. These proxy wars will continue. Vietnam will be another one of these later on, even more devastating than this war. But what we do see is that the Cold War has changed Americans' mentality. There is now this fear of communist aggression. We've seen it in Germany. We've seen it in Korea. And frankly, they're going to start turning inwards. And we realize, especially after multiple Soviet spies are captured in the United States, that there are communists here, that there are Soviet spies amongst us, and that is very fearful for many. In fact, they're going to turn within even the U.S. government to start trying to point out these spies. So next time we meet, we are going to take a look at, let me double check. Oh yeah, last page, here we go. Last page, satellite photo of North and South Korea. I mentioned earlier in the lecture about how those two nations went completely different paths after the Soviets had adopted their communist system in the north and the Americans in the south. Just look at this nighttime photo. Look at how the economy of South Korea has led to prosperity in those areas where you have industry, you have major cities, very wealthy area. But compare that to the north, okay? I mean, there's really only one major city, Pyongyang, that you can see there lit up at night. There's not even electricity in the rest of the country. So that communist experiment has not really gone well for those people. So anyways, Korea, a terrible, terrible war that is often forgotten because, well, frankly, you can even say that the Korean War is the first war that America has not won. That's a major milestone, right? We have always won the wars that we've engaged in, not this one. So, anyways, we will leave it at that. Thank you guys for tuning in. Next time, we'll talk about the Red Scare and the hunt for communist spies.